guys, UnoPro here to talk about balance changes from the latest patch 1.66. We saw a couple nerfs and a couple tweaks to cards that weren't strictly better or worse depending on the situation. So let's get straight into things. The simplest one is the Black Soulless nerf, so we will start with that. So this used to, instead of just giving to attack, it used to give to health as well. Was a very good card because of the little Bloodborne spell. I think this is still a very good card, and I think the nerf was very justified. It was a card I really wanted to see nerfed. Personally, I just think it basically just won the game if there wasn't for an answer for that. And for a 5-drop that has good stats, even when dispelled, that's way too much on one card. Now I think it's still a very good card. 4/7 stats is still pretty good for a 5-drop. It has the potential to do so much damage, and it still has that advantage of being a real good body even when it's dispelled. So able to still do a ton of damage, still a massive threat. We'll see a bit less play just because it's not as ridiculous, but I think you'll still see a decent amount of play, and it's a pretty balanced card. Maybe it actually needs some synergy built around it to be really good now. So not too much to say about that one, but definitely still very strong card. Okay, on to Emerald Rejuvenator. Now this is an interesting one in that it's not just strictly a nerf, it's not strictly a buff. So the stats did go from 3/3 to 4/4, back to how Emerald Rejuvenator was before, but now it heals both generals. So obviously this card is a lot worse than old Emerald Rejuvenator before, the patch before, where it was just same stats, same mana cost, but it only healed your own general, where it was basically in every deck. So why would they change a card that was healing for 4 and make it heal both generals? Well, before, when we had the old Emerald Rejuvenator, it was basically in every deck regardless. Songhai was playing very aggressively but still had a couple of Emerald Rejuvenators in a lot of decks. Now I don't think the developers want healing to be a mechanic that's in every deck, because it's pretty brainless in the sense that you just put in 3 Emerald Rejuvenators. But they want healing to be viable, and a 3/3 body is pretty terrible for 4 mana. So I think the reasoning from this is really defining what decks want it. It's not just any deck that wants to go late. If they also need to win by damaging down their opponent, so let's see that card. This is a card that allows players to really grind out games and who really need the healing. We don't see a lot of decks like that at the moment because the game is still very tempo based, and Vath has stuff like Earthsphere. But definitely in the future we can see more archetypes, and I think maybe Cassivia probably doesn't want this because Shadow Nova is really relevant damage wise. But if we see just a Abyssing and Control that's somehow not Cassivia, then maybe that could be the deck, or a very heavy Vitruvian Control. It doesn't really fit into too many archetypes now. One, it really does, and something I'm really happy about. I don't particularly like Zoran, but I like the fact that counterplay are looking at the generals who aren't played, who are a lot weaker than the other general in the faction, and they're looking for ways to buff them. So why is this buff? Well, basically all the healing effect cards in Liner work off all minions and all generals. So when you play this, if the enemy general is damaged, which it probably will be, and is damaged, then suddenly you're getting double the effect of all your minions, which is really nice, and basically makes cards like Sunriser, the 3/2 2-mana one that benefits off healing and gets buffs, really good, and makes any of those cards even more must kill. Unfortunately, because it's still a 4 mana cost, it's hard to combo those out until late game, but still really nice, and healing your opponent as a Lioneye is not the end of the world when you're looking to grind them down. Stuff like Martyrdom, if you're already playing it, less of a downside, and not having that 3/3 body is really important. So at times just playing a 4/4 for 4 is not terrible, especially compared to a 3/3. So very nice, and I really do like the fact that counterplay is trying to include all generals, make them all viable, and really paying attention, because it's questionable to sometimes buff a faction, but what they've done is really nice when it's already good. But this isn't ever really going to buff Argion, who's already really strong, and it's definitely going to buff Zoran. So I think that's the main part of this change, and also just making sure that it's not as simple as just sticking it in when you're a late game deck, but also making it viable. Okay, so our next one was Vindicator. Now Vindicator was a really interesting change, and something that a lot of people weren't too happy about. So I've talked a lot in the past about the balance philosophy, and I think the devs are pretty on a similar page in that they tend to balance around strength of faction or the deck rather than individual cards, because we're allowed to have power cards that define factions and can swing games, but as long as the faction is balanced. And Magmar was probably the weakest faction, or the second weakest faction in the last patch. So why'd they nerf Vindicator? Well, first of all, Rush has always been a troublesome keyword. A lot of the stuff that has been a problem in the game has been caused by Rush. Old Third Wish was a lot worse because Saber Spine, Tiger plus Third Wish made it a lot better, a lot more reliable. All these different combos, Tuskborn. Rush is a very, very powerful keyword. And it also limits design space, which we saw actually immediately with the new Magmar Sister, which is absolutely insane. And now suddenly you add a Vindicator on it, it becomes like a Mechanta War Beast with added benefits. So it couldn't really have that, and even if it wasn't broken with that card down the line when they make a new expansion, every card that they make for Magmar or for a neutral has to be considered with Vindicator. So it's nice that they've really planned out and making these preemptive changes, and I really like how Counterplay is approaching the game. They're definitely considering how things will affect. So when they're changing Emerald Rejuvenator, they're considering how will it affect Zoran, how will it affect all these decks, and they're also making sure they have plenty of design space. They want lots of ways to go for Magmar. They want to have these really powerful minions that stand alone, balanced by the fact that they can't attack that turn, and it makes it a lot harder to balance cards when Vindicator can give rush to anything. Okay, so let's actually talk about what the card is now, because now it gains +2/+2 whenever your opponent draws a card. So in a sense, it's very, very similar to Grow +2/+2. Now we haven't really seen any Grow minions be viable, at least not at the highest level. But this one is a bit better than a Grow minion because there's ways to make your opponent draw more cards. Firstly, they're going to just draw the cards themselves, so maybe you can stop them drawing cards or make them a little bit hesitant to. You have stuff like Spelljammer, so it goes up to a Grow 4/4, which is definitely pretty good. And then you have the most obvious synergy, which is Starhorn Bloodspell, which basically you can play at that turn and then play your Bloodborne spell, and it's already a 3 mana 3/5, which is actually really good. It's going to grow by the time you attack. It's a 5/7 for 3 mana, which is actually really good. That can grow even more. So I actually think this card is pretty good. I expected to see a decent amount of play, especially in Starhorn decks. I think this will be a 3 of most likely. It is still pretty weak to dispel, but then again, it's a 3-drop. 3 drops being weak to dispel isn't the end of the world. Stuff like Fireblaze Obelisk still gets played, and I think it's pretty good. And if you can play it with Starhorn, then you can have it as a 3/5, which doesn't have to be played really safe. Sometimes that's the problem with Grow minions, is that you want to play them safe when they're low standard, but then your opponent just runs away from them. Now you have this big fatty that's actually not doing anything because you had to play him safe. So if you can, play it on turn 4, which is pretty reasonable to play at 3/5, and use your Bloodborne spell, which you want to be using, then it actually seems pretty good. So I think this card is still very, very good. Probably not as crazy as the old Vindicator, but at least they're kind of going back to the roots of Magmar, which is having big creatures, really good creatures that stand alone, and your general being really tanky, which is definitely some of the changes we've seen in the past, and with the new Magmar Sister. So I quite like this change. Hopefully Magmar is still at the power level of the other factions, because Vindicator was a card they relied on quite a lot, but the new Sister is so amazing that I think Magmar will definitely be in a fine spot. Okay, so our last change was the change to the most powerful faction in the game, in my opinion. I know some tier lists say like Abyssian was, but I still think Xerix was, and at the very least, the most powerful Bloodborne spell in the game has now been nerfed. So basically, instead of having a 2/2 with Rush that got removed at the end of the turn, now it's a 2/2 that does not have Rush, but will stay past the turn. Now, is this a nerf, or is this simply a change? Well, it's definitely a nerf. It's basically as simple as that. Very rarely would you want to have a Dervish that would stay on the board rather than actually just using value immediately. Because if you're just playing on the board, it's basically, a lot of time at worst, if you're not playing really safe, which is a bit counterproductive, it's just going to be doing 2 damage to the general if they choose to. Whereas before, anything you're trading into, you can just trade straight into that. It's a little bit better at being proactive when face damage doesn't matter, but you're Xerix. You can put so much pressure on your Bloodborne spell, and it's so good at removing full health minions. Now it's a lot easier to play around. So definitely a massive nerf. Still a decent. It's similar to Lilith's Bloodborne spell. Same amount of stats, but there's no Death Watch synergy, and Dervish synergy is kind of lacking. Windstorm Obelisk is actually maybe decent now, because going to 3 health is actually really, really important. That's a big threshold. We don't really see many minions that have 2 HP being played, but definitely a very big nerf. And Sarge may look to take over as the Vitruvian go-to general. It will depend though, because Sarge does need cards to be built around. Zerik's probably still a better all-round general, and still some pretty strong cards in Vitruvian. So I think it'll be less of an all-round, just remove everything or go face. And Vitruvian decks will have to specialize. Do they want to counter control? Do they want to be more aggressive with dervishes themselves? Because before it was kind of doing everything. So I think this is a good change. And I really like the fact that apart from the Vindicator and the Emerald Rejuvenator changes, which weren't actually strictly nerfs or buffs, the 2 nerfs that we saw were arguably the 2 best generals in the game. I don't think many people would argue with that. Lilith and Xerix were definitely the best generals, if not at least top 3, top 4. So the fact that they're balancing against the best decks is really, really important, and I think that most of the competitive community would agree with that as well. So some really nice changes. I think most people are pretty happy with it, and I think the fact that people were complaining last season that we didn't see any balance changes, taking an extra month, well, not even a full month, this is a mid-month patch, which we don't see a lot of balance changes. I think it really turned out well. It became very clear who was the best decks, and I'm not sure we would have seen necessarily a Lilith nerf otherwise, which I think it did deserve. But I definitely saw less Lilith than other decks, and definitely a lot less compared to the power level of the deck. So I think the fact that the meta stabilized, and we saw that there was some counters to these decks, but they weren't really enough to remove the meta. At least give players a chance, which they did, and they come up with some really nice nerfs. All the cards are still very, very playable and are pretty balanced now, so I'm very, very happy for the patch. Let us know what you think as well. I think this game's heading in a really nice direction, and I think the devs have done a really good job balancing this month. Anyway guys, that's all from me. If you want to see more, make sure to like and subscribe. I did another video on the 7 Sisters, so if you want to see my review of those cards, then please do check that out. And I also did a Spell High video using some of the new cards, well, mainly just the Sister, but just changing it out and testing it around. I look forward to testing out all these new decks with the new changes, and yeah, that's basically it. I'll see you next time.